The files turned red at 0400 hours Galactic Standard Time, which was particularly unfortunate because that's when Administrative Coordinator Velnish was having his third breakfast. You need to understand something about Velnish. He was a Corthelian, which meant he had 7 stomachs, 6 of which were decorative and one that actually worked but complained about it constantly. When his communication terminal started shrieking like a wounded plasma conduit, he choked on what can only be described as the galactic equivalent of oatmeal, except it was purple and occasionally insulted you. Unauthorized access. Unauthorized access. Class 17 files compromised. Velnish stared at the screen. Then he stared at his oatmeal, then back at the screen. The oatmeal seemed like the less complicated problem. That's not possible, he muttered, his tentacles quivering in what psychologists would later describe as acute bureaucratic distress. Class 17 doesn't exist, except it did exist. It had existed for approximately 247 years, hidden behind so many layers of encryption, misinformation, and outright lies that even the lies had started filing complaints about being overworked. The Galactic Council had exactly one file marked Class 17. One single planet in a database containing roughly 42 trillion celestial bodies. Earth. And now someone had leaked it. Velnish did what any reasonable bureaucrat would do in this situation. He pretended his terminal was broken, finished his third breakfast, started his fourth, and then very carefully admitted to himself that this was, in the technical parlance of his people, a monumentally catastrophic shitstorm. By the time he reported it to his supervisor, the file had already pinged across 600,000 servers in the Outer Rim. By lunch, it was trending on Galactinet under the hashtag #WhatIsClass17. By dinner, every single species with access to faster-than-light communication was asking the same question. What the hell was on Earth? The Galactic Council convened an emergency session, which was already a bad sign, because the last emergency session had been about the Great Florgian Cheese incident of 3241, and that had resulted in 3 systems being quarantined for smelling terrible. The council chambers looked exactly like you'd expect a place called the Council Chambers to look, which is to say, unnecessarily grand, completely impractical, and designed by someone who thought echo chambers were a feature rather than a bug. High Councillor Threxis stood at the central podium, all 4 of his eyes blinking in different directions, which his species did when they were lying or nervous. Right now, he was both. "Esteemed representatives," he began, his translator struggling with his accent, "we are here to address the completely unfounded rumors about a so-called Class 17 designation." "Bullshit!" shouted Representative Kvaline from the back, who was a Bristovian and therefore incapable of speaking at a reasonable volume. Bristovians communicated through what essentially amounted to controlled explosions. Every sentence was an act of violence against eardrums. "We've all seen the files. They're real. They're red and they're everywhere." Threxis's tentacles drooped. "Yes. Well, about that." The chamber erupted into chaos. 27 different species started shouting in 43 different languages, which the universal translators gamely attempted to process before giving up and just displaying "error, too much stupid" on everyone's screens. This went on for approximately 12 minutes until Councillor Ilandra, who was a whispering one and therefore communicated through interpretive silence, didn't say anything so profoundly that everyone shut up. Threxis cleared his 17 throats. "The designation exists. Class 17 is real. And yes, it applies to exactly one planet, a little backwater place in the Sol system called Earth. You could have heard a pin drop if pins made sounds in the vacuum of space, which they don't, but you get the idea." "But here's the thing," Threxis continued, his voice taking on the desperate quality of someone trying to explain why the kitchen is on fire and it's totally fine. The classification system only goes up to Class 16. We have Class 1, peaceful agrarian societies who've barely discovered fire. Class 2, early industrial. Class 3, atomic age. You get the idea. Class 16 is reserved for species that have mastered dimensional engineering, weaponized black holes, and can fold space like a really aggressive origami instructor. They're terrifying. They're powerful. They're not as bad as Class 17. "What the hell is Class 17 then?" bellowed Kavaline, shattering 3 light fixtures. Threxis looked like he wanted to crawl into one of his own orifices and die there. "We don't actually have a formal definition. We created the classification specifically for Earth because nothing else fit." The chamber exploded again. This time someone threw a chair. In zero gravity, it just sort of drifted sadly toward the ceiling, spinning slowly, which somehow made the gesture even more pathetic. While the Galactic Council descended into what could only be described as organized pandemonium, the leaked files were spreading across the galaxy like a particularly virulent meme. And like all leaked classified documents, approximately 97% of people were interpreting them completely wrong. On the mining colony of Vestris Prime, a Croakian dock worker named Glibbert was explaining his theory to anyone who would listen. "It's obvious. Class 17 means they've got 17 different types of doomsday weapons. 17, that's like more than 16. They're probably made of explosions." His co-worker, a Florian named Petaline, shook her flower-like head. "You're an idiot, Glibbert. It clearly states here that Earth has Class 17 diplomatic status. They're so good at negotiating that they negotiated their way into a classification that doesn't exist. It's genius. It's terrifying. Wait, that doesn't make sense either." In the academic spires of Nexus University, Professor Indelian was giving an impromptu lecture to a packed auditorium. He was a Graythian, which meant he had a brain roughly the size of a small moon and the social skills of a particularly awkward rock. "The mathematics are fascinating," he squeaked, his voice 3 octaves higher than anyone expected from a creature that looked like a philosophy textbook had mated with an octopus. "If we extrapolate the danger curves from Class 1 through 16, Class 17 would represent a civilization capable of destabilizing the fundamental constants of the universe. They could theoretically unravel space-time itself. Or they're really good at baking. The error margins are substantial." A student raised their appendage. "Professor, couldn't it just mean they're moderately dangerous and the Council is exaggerating?" "Get out of my lecture hall!" But the single best misinterpretation came from the entertainment networks, specifically from a talk show host named Vrix the Opinionated, whose show, Vrix's Thoughts Usually Wrong But Always Loud, had approximately 6 billion regular viewers across 1,800 systems. Vrix was a belomoth, which looked exactly like what you'd get if a moth and a megaphone had a baby and that baby had opinions. He hovered in front of his cameras, wings buzzing with excitement. "Friends, neighbors, sentients of all shapes and sizes." His voice boomed, somehow both melodious and deeply annoying. "I have solved the mystery. Class 17 isn't about danger. It's not about technology. It's about weirdness. Earth is so fundamentally bizarre that the Council had to create an entirely new category. Think about it. They're probably inside out, or made of time, or they communicate by throwing feces at each other." His producer, off-camera, whispered urgently. "Vrix, that last one is actually—" "Silence! I'm on a roll!" While the galaxy argued, debated, panicked, and generally lost its collective mind, something very important was happening on Earth. Something that would make everything infinitely more complicated. Earth had no idea aliens existed. Earth was going about its business in blissful ignorance, worried about things like traffic, taxes, and whether that weird noise the refrigerator was making meant it was about to die. Earth was days away from launching its newest deep space telescope, designed to look at distant galaxies and definitely not designed to accidentally intercept alien transmissions, but it was about to. At the Farpoint Deep Space Monitoring Station in New Zealand, Dr. Harriet Vollmer was having what she later described as the worst good day of my entire life. She was a radio astronomer, which meant she spent most of her time listening to the cosmic equivalent of static and pretending it was meaningful. She had 3 PhDs, 2 cats, and 1 very persistent migraine. "Come on, you beautiful bastard," she muttered at her equipment, adjusting frequencies. "Give me something interesting, anything, a pulsar, a quasar, a really loud space rock. I am begging you." The universe, in its infinite wisdom and terrible sense of timing, decided to answer. The signal came through at 0247 local time. Not a pulsar, not a quasar, not a space rock, a transmission, a structured transmission, with patterns, with meaning. Harriet's coffee mug slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, which she didn't notice because her brain was too busy having what scientists call a significant ontological crisis. "Oh, fuck!" she whispered. Then louder, "Oh, fuck!" Then she grabbed her phone with shaking hands and called her colleague in Chile. "Rodrigo, wake up! We're not alone!" Rodrigo Velasquez, groggy and confused at his facility in the Atacama Desert, mumbled something about it being 2 in the morning. "I don't care what time it is. I'm picking up alien transmissions." There was a pause. "Harriet, did you take your medication?" "I'm not having an episode, you asshole! Get on your equipment and check frequency band 779er. 3 minutes later, Rodrigo called back. His voice was very small. "Harriet, yes? I'm looking at it right now. And we need to call everyone, right now. Every observatory, every space agency, everyone who has ever looked at the sky and wondered. Because this is... Harriet, these aren't random signals. These are conversations, thousands of them, and they're talking about us." Harriet Vollmer sat down very carefully in her chair, stared at her broken coffee mug, and said the most reasonable thing she could think of under the circumstances. "Well, shit." Within 6 hours, every major observatory on Earth had confirmed it. Within 12 hours, the world's governments knew. Within 18 hours, a very panicked UN Security Council was having the most surreal meeting in human history. The Secretary General, a composed woman named Amara Okonkwo, who had dealt with wars, famines, and diplomatic incidents that would make your hair turn white, stood at the podium looking like she'd aged 10 years overnight. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, then stopped, then started again. "I'm going to skip the diplomatic pleasantries because what the actual hell? Our radio astronomers have intercepted communications from what can only be described as an interstellar internet. There are thousands of civilizations out there, thousands, and they're all talking about US. The Russian ambassador raised his hand. "What are they saying?" "That's the weird part." Amara pulled up a translated transcript. "They're arguing about what we are. Something about a classification system. We're apparently Category 17, which seems to be simultaneously real and not supposed to exist. The translations are rough, but the general sentiment appears to be somewhere between confused and terrified." The American ambassador leaned forward. "Why would they be terrified of us? We haven't even left our own solar system yet. That's what we're trying to figure out. But here's the really concerning part. About an hour ago, we picked up what appears to be a directive from something called the Galactic Council. They're sending a delegation to Earth. They'll be here in approximately 72 hours. The chamber erupted. Questions flew like shrapnel. Amara raised her hands for silence. People, I know this is unprecedented. I know this is terrifying. I know that every single assumption we've ever made about our place in the universe just got thrown out the window and set on fire. But we have 3 days to prepare for first contact, and I'll be damned if we look like idiots when they arrive." In a small apartment in Tokyo, a graduate student named Kenji Sato was having a very different reaction to the news. He was an anthropology student specializing in first contact protocols, which until today had been the academic equivalent of writing fan fiction about unicorns. His thesis, Theoretical Frameworks for Human-Alien Communication, Why We're Probably Screwed, had been mostly a joke. It wasn't funny anymore. He stared at his television screen, where news anchors were trying very hard to remain professional while clearly losing their minds. One anchor suggested the aliens were coming to invite humanity to a galactic federation. Another suggested they were coming to wipe us out. A third suggested it was all an elaborate hoax, which seemed increasingly unlikely given that every telescope on Earth was now pointed at the same incoming signatures. Kenji opened his laptop and started typing furiously. If aliens were coming, and they were worried about humanity, there had to be a reason. He began searching through the intercepted transmissions that had been leaked online, running them through translation algorithms, looking for patterns. 3 hours later, he found something, a fragment of a conversation that made his blood run cold. Cannot allow them to discover their classification parameters before we establish containment protocols. The last time a 17-capable species achieved self-awareness of their status, it took 4 centuries to stabilize the sector. Must approach with extreme caution. Remember what happened to the Draconid mission. Kenji sat back in his chair. They're not scared of us, he muttered. They're scared of what happens when we find out why we're Class 17. He grabbed his phone and started making calls. Someone needed to tell the UN. Someone needed to prepare. Because if the galaxy was this terrified of Earth knowing its own classification, then that classification must be very interesting indeed. The delegation arrived exactly on schedule, which was impressive given that they'd had to cross roughly 40 light-years in 72 hours. Their ship appeared in orbit around Earth with all the fanfare of a middle manager arriving at a meeting they really didn't want to attend. The ship itself looked like someone had taken an office building, made it cry and then launched it into space. It was grey. It was bureaucratic. It had portholes that seemed designed to make you feel inadequate. It broadcast a message in 1,700 languages simultaneously, which was overkill. But the Galactic Council never did anything by halves. Greetings, people of Earth. We come in peace. We represent the Galactic Council. We request permission to land and establish diplomatic relations. Please do not panic. Everything is fine. There is no reason for concern. We are definitely not worried about anything. At the United Nations headquarters in New York, hastily converted into humanity's first contact center, Amara Okonkwo watched the ship descend with a mixture of awe and deep suspicion. They sound nervous, observed her newly appointed first contact advisor, a linguist named Dr. Ephraim Kowalski, who specialized in detecting bullshit across language barriers. They sound terrified, Amara corrected, which is fascinating because we're the ones who should be terrified. They have faster-than-light travel. They have a galactic civilization. We have nuclear weapons and social media. This math doesn't add up. The alien delegation landed in a specially prepared area in Central Park, which had been cleared of tourists, vendors, and one very persistent hot dog seller who insisted the aliens might want lunch. The ship's doors opened with a hiss that sounded distinctly apologetic. Out stepped Councillor Threxis, flanked by a security detail that looked more nervous than intimidating. Behind them came a parade of representatives from various species, each one looking like they'd rather be literally anywhere else. Threxis approached the Human Greeting Committee, all 4 eyes blinking in that way that made Ephraim immediately note, "Subject is lying or about to lie. Greetings, humans! Wonderful to finally meet you. We've been monitoring your development for quite some time. Nothing creepy about that. Totally normal." Amara extended her hand, which Threxis stared at like it might explode. After an awkward pause, he extended a tentacle, and they shook, which was filmed by approximately 6 billion cameras and immediately became the most watched moment in human history. "Welcome to Earth, Councillor Threxis. We have many questions. I'm sure you do. And we have many answers. Some of them might even be true." Ephraim leaned over to Amara. "He's definitely lying." I heard that, Threxis's translator chirped. And yes, fine, I'm nervous. Can you blame me? You're Class 17. The entire human delegation froze. About that, Amara said carefully. We've intercepted some of your communications. We know about the classification system. We know we're supposedly Category 17. We know that this category apparently doesn't officially exist. What we don't know is why. Threxis's tentacles went limp. Behind him, several delegates made sounds that the translators struggled to interpret, but generally fell somewhere between "oh no" and "we're all going to die." That's actually why we're here, Threxis admitted. We need to have a conversation, a very careful conversation, about what makes your species special. And by special, I mean terrifying. And by terrifying, I mean we've been trying to figure out how to tell you this without causing a galaxy-wide panic. Try us, said Amara. Threxis looked at his delegation. They looked back. Several shrugged, which is a universal gesture across most species, capable of having shoulders or shoulder equivalents. All right, but we should do this inside, and you might want to sit down, and possibly have some of your anxiety medication ready. Do humans have anxiety medication? We have so much anxiety medication, Ephraim confirmed. They moved the meeting to the UN General Assembly Hall, which had been hastily retrofitted to accommodate species with wildly different environmental requirements. There were heat lamps for the cold-blooded delegates, cooling units for the ice worlders, and one very confused representative from a species that breathed methane and had to stay in a specialized tank that kept trying to leak. Threxis stood at the central podium, looking at the assembled humans and aliens, and began what he later described as the worst PowerPoint presentation of my life. Right, classifications. The Galactic Council developed a system approximately 8,000 years ago to categorize species based on their technological development and potential threat level. Class 1 is basic. Class 16 is, well, let me show you. A hologram appeared showing a species that looked like if anger itself achieved consciousness and learned to build starships. The Vorath Collective, Class 16. They can weaponize stars. They've mastered dimensional travel. They've conquered 400 systems through sheer military might. They're horrible, but they're predictable. We know what they want. Power, territory, resources, standard terrible empire stuff. The hologram changed to show Earth. And then there's you. Amara leaned forward. What's so special about us? We can't weaponize stars. We've barely left our own planet. We still argue about whether pineapple belongs on pizza. That's exactly the problem, Threxis exploded. You're not special because of what you can do. You're special because of what you are. Every other species in the galaxy follows certain patterns, certain rules, certain logical progressions. You don't. Ephraim raised his hand. Can you be more specific? Threxis pulled up more data. Let me give you an example. The Krelthian species achieved spaceflight in the year 3247. They were Class 8 at the time, standard technological progression. They discovered fusion power, then antimatter, then eventually figured out faster-than-light travel. It took them 4,000 years. Very reasonable, very predictable. And us? Amara asked. You went from first flight to nuclear weapons in 40 years. You went from nuclear weapons to landing on your own moon in 24 years. You invented the internet, decided it wasn't chaotic enough, and then let everyone use it. You have weapons that can destroy your entire civilization, and you've come close to using them multiple times over things like economic systems and borders. You're insane. That's not Class 17, Ephraim protested. That's just rapid development and poor impulse control. That's not even the Class 17 part. Threxis was gesticulating wildly now, his tentacles flailing. The Class 17 designation isn't about your technology. It's about your culture. He pulled up another hologram. This one showed statistical data that made absolutely no sense. Every species in the galaxy has what we call rational self-interest. They act in ways that benefit their survival. They form alliances based on mutual gain. They go to war over resources. They're logical. And humans aren't? Amara was starting to feel insulted. Humans are baffling. You have a concept called dying on a hill. You will literally sacrifice everything for principles, not resources, not territory, abstract concepts. You have this thing called spite, where you'll hurt yourselves just to hurt someone else. You invented sarcasm, which doesn't even translate properly into most languages. You create RT about being sad. You have something called gallows humor, where you make jokes when you're about to die. You're not logical. You're not predictable. You're chaos in biological form. The room was silent. Humans and aliens alike stared at Threxis. That's it? Kenji Sato, who had been invited as an expert consultant, stood up from the back of the room. We're Class 17 because we're weird. Not just weird, Threxis insisted. Fundamentally, unpredictably, dangerously weird. Let me show you something. He pulled up a historical document. 70 years ago, we had another species that exhibited some human-like traits. The Draconids. They were Class 12, militarily powerful, technologically advanced. They had this thing where they'd sometimes act against their own self-interest for honor. It was strange but manageable. So we sent a delegation to establish formal relations. What happened? Amara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. They threw a party for us. A huge celebration. They were so excited to meet other intelligent life. They prepared food, entertainment, cultural exchanges. And then, in the middle of the party, one of our delegates accidentally insulted their traditional dance. Not even badly, just a minor cultural misunderstanding. And do you know what the Draconids did? Started a war, Ephraim guessed. Worse, they laughed it off. They said accidents happen. They forgave us immediately and insisted we continue celebrating. Threxis's eyes were wide with remembered horror. We had no idea how to handle it. Forgiveness without negotiation, acceptance without concession. It violated every diplomatic protocol. It took us 3 years to figure out how to proceed, and the Draconids were barely exhibiting a fraction of the unpredictable traits you humans display. So you made us Class 17 because we might be too friendly. Amara was struggling to follow the logic. No! Well, partly, but that's not the main issue. Threxis was pacing now, clearly agitated. The problem is we don't know what you'll do. With every other species, we can model their behavior. We can predict their responses. We have algorithms. With humans, every simulation we've run produces completely different results. You could become our greatest allies. You could become a galactic threat. You could ignore us entirely and focus on arguing about your pineapple pizza. We don't know, and that terrifies us. Kenji stood up again. Can I see those simulations? Threxis hesitated, then pulled up the data. Kenji studied it for several minutes, while the room waited in tense silence. These are fascinating, Kenji finally said, but they're all based on the assumption that humans will act as a unified species. That's your first mistake. We're not unified. We're barely organized. We have roughly 200 different nations, thousands of cultures, millions of competing interests. You're not dealing with one unpredictable species. You're dealing with billions of unpredictable individuals. Every alien in the room made a sound of distress. One of them fainted. The methane breather's tank started leaking faster. That's worse, wailed a representative from the Flitterwing Concordance. How do you govern? How do you make decisions? How do you function? Very poorly, shouted someone from the human section, which got a nervous laugh. But we do function, Amara added. Chaotically, yes. Unpredictably, absolutely. But we survive, we adapt, we figure it out. And sometimes, just sometimes, we even cooperate. Threxis slumped into a chair that wasn't designed for his anatomy and looked generally defeated. So now you know. You're Class 17 because you break every model we have for how intelligent species behave. You're the only civilization we've encountered that seems to operate on controlled chaos and stubbornness. And we've been trying to figure out how to handle you for 200 years. 200 years? Ephraim's eyes narrowed. You've been watching us for 200 years. Since your industrial revolution, yes. We've had monitoring stations in your outer solar system. Don't worry. We're very ethical about our surveillance. We only watch most of the time. That's not ethical, several humans shouted simultaneously. See? Threxes pointed at them. That's what I mean. In any other species, the response to learning you've been monitored would be either aggressive military response or calm diplomatic negotiation. You're doing both and also being sarcastic about it. How do we plan for that? Amara stood up, her expression somewhere between amused and annoyed. Councillor Threxis, let me explain something about humans. You're right that we're unpredictable. You're right that we're chaotic. But you know what else we are? Practical. You have a problem. You don't know how to deal with us. Well, here's a wild idea. Instead of trying to predict what we'll do, why don't you just ask us? Have you considered that? Threxis blinked all four eyes in sequence. That's not how galactic diplomacy works. Well, maybe that's the problem with galactic diplomacy. Amara was warming up now. You've spent 2 centuries watching us from a distance, building models, creating classifications, trying to fit us into your neat little categories. But you never actually talked to us. You treated us like a problem to be solved instead of people to be engaged with. But you're Class 17, Threxis protested weakly. Which apparently means we're weird and unpredictable. Fine, we accept that. But you know what? Maybe the rest of the galaxy could use a little unpredictability. Maybe your perfect systems and models and simulations have made you too rigid, too afraid of anything that doesn't fit your patterns. The human section of the assembly erupted in applause. The alien section looked horrified. Threxis looked like he was having an existential crisis in real time. I need to make some calls, he muttered, pulling out a communication device. This is above my pay grade. Over the next 3 days, something unprecedented happened. The Galactic Council representatives stayed on Earth, and instead of formal diplomatic negotiations, something much stranger occurred. They just talked, humans and aliens sitting down in groups, sharing information, asking questions, and slowly, carefully, beginning to understand each other. In a cafe in New York, Kavaline the Bristovian was having coffee with a human journalist named Patricia Holloway. Every time Kavaline spoke, windows rattled and dogs barked, but Patricia was taking notes furiously. "So your species communicates through writing?" Kavaline boomed, shattering Patricia's 3rd recorder of the day. "Yes, and speaking, but quieter than you," Patricia said, pulling out yet another recorder. "Can I ask you something? Why were you all so scared of us? Because you're unpredictable. You do things that don't make sense. You create art about being sad. Who does that? Artists, lots of them. It's called catharsis." "What's catharsis?" "It's when you process difficult emotions through creative expression to achieve emotional release and understanding." Kvalin stared at her, all 3 of his eyes blinking independently. "That's the most beautiful and terrifying thing I've ever heard." In a laboratory in Geneva, Graythian scientists were meeting with human physicists, and both groups were discovering that their approaches to science were fundamentally different. Professor Eindelion was explaining Graythian mathematical models to Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who kept interrupting with increasingly bizarre questions. "But what if you just didn't use that equation?" Yuki asked. "It's the correct equation. It's been proven across 600,000 experiments." "Sure, but what if there's a different correct equation that gives you the same result through a completely different method?" That's not how mathematics works. "Isn't it, though? I mean, there are usually multiple paths to the same answer. We call it lateral thinking." Eindelion's brain, which was the size of a small moon, nearly imploded trying to process this concept. "You mean you intentionally look for alternative solutions even when you have a working solution?" "All the time. Sometimes the alternative is more efficient. Sometimes it's more elegant. Sometimes it's just more fun." What does fun have to do with science? Everything? If science isn't at least a little bit fun, why are we even doing it? Eindelian was silent for a long moment. Then very quietly, he said, I think my entire worldview just collapsed. But the most significant conversation was happening in a secure conference room where Councillor Threxis, Amara Okonkwo, and a team of human and alien strategists were trying to figure out what came next. The problem, Threxis explained, pulling up galactic maps, is that you can't join the Galactic Council, not yet, not until we understand how to integrate a Class 17 species into our systems. So we're quarantined? Kenji asked. He'd become an unofficial ambassador, mostly because he understood both human chaos and alien rigidity. Not quarantined, just carefully observed, for your own safety and ours. That sounds like quarantined with extra steps, Ephraim muttered. Amara leaned back in her chair. What if we proposed something different? What if we don't try to fit into your existing systems? What if we create something new? Like what? Threxis asked cautiously. An experimental protocol. Earth becomes a test case for integrating unpredictable species into galactic civilization. We maintain our autonomy, you get to study how we interact with the broader galaxy, and we establish guidelines together through actual cooperation instead of theoretical modeling. Threxis paused. That's actually not a terrible idea. But it would require the Council's approval, and they're very set in their ways. Then it's time they learned to adapt, Amara said firmly. Because here's the thing about humans. We're going to reach the stars eventually. We're going to develop faster than light travel. We're going to become part of the galactic community whether you're ready or not. The only question is whether we do it cooperatively, or if we stumble in like a drunk person at a formal dinner party. You would do that, wouldn't you? Threxis said. And it wasn't quite a question. You'd just show up, unannounced, unprepared, and probably make everything incredibly complicated. Absolutely, Amara smiled. It's kind of our thing. Threxis made a sound that the translator interpreted as resigned laughter. I'm going to need so much therapy after this assignment. The proposal went to the Galactic Council, which debated it for 3 weeks. During that time, Earth and the alien delegation continued their unprecedented cultural exchange. Human musicians performed for aliens who'd never heard music with lyrics. Alien artists created holograms that made humans weep. The methane breather finally got their tank fixed and was deeply appreciative, though they still didn't understand why humans kept asking if they were okay, because in their language, the concept of okay didn't exist. Things either were or weren't. The human obsession with intermediate states baffled them. When the Council's decision came through, Threxis gathered the human leadership in the UN Assembly. The Council has made their decision, he announced, and I'm going to be honest, I think several of them had minor breakdowns during the debate, but they've agreed. Earth will become what we're calling a Class 17 experimental integration zone. What does that mean exactly? Amara asked. Threxis pulled up the official documentation, which was approximately 6,000 pages long, and written in the galactic equivalent of legal jargon, which made human legal jargon look straightforward by comparison. Essentially, you get limited access to galactic technology and information. We establish a permanent embassy here. You get to send representatives to council sessions as observers. And most importantly, we study how your unpredictable nature interacts with galactic civilization, so we can develop better protocols for other potential Class 17 species we might encounter. So we're guinea pigs, Ephraim said flatly. You're pioneers, Threxis corrected, then wilted under the human stares. All right, yes, you're also kind of guinea pigs, but important guinea pigs, with diplomatic immunity. I'll take it, Amara decided. But we have some conditions of our own. Ah, of course you do, Threxis sighed. What are they? First, full transparency. No more watching us for 200 years without telling us. Second, mutual technology exchange. You don't just give us toys, we share what we develop too. Third, Earth maintains complete sovereignty. No galactic laws supersede our own governance. And fourth, we want access to the full Class 17 documentation. All of it. We deserve to know exactly what you think we are. Threxus's tentacles twitched nervously. That last one is going to be problematic. Why? Because some of the documentation is unflattering and possibly offensive, and definitely written by bureaucrats who've never actually met a human and were mostly just scared and making things up. We can handle it, Kenji assured him. We invented social media. We're immune to being offended by strangers on the internet. I don't know what that means, but it sounds ominous, Threxus muttered. Fine, I'll forward the complete files, but don't say I didn't warn you. The Class 17 files arrived 6 hours later, and reading them was an experience that several human researchers later described as hilarious, horrifying, and humbling in equal measure. Dr. Harriet Vollmer, who'd first detected the alien signals, was reading through them with her team at Farpoint Station. Every few minutes someone would burst out laughing or make a sound of pure disbelief. Listen to this, Harriet read aloud. Entry from Galactic Year 8742, approximately Earth Year 1847. The humans have begun killing each other with increased efficiency. However, they're also simultaneously creating art about how sad this makes them. Recommendation: continue observation. Additional note, they've invented a device called a telegraph that lets them send messages long distances. They're using it for business, military coordination, and apparently jokes. Classification review recommended. They were worried about telegrams? Rodrigo laughed. Wait until they found out about memes. Harriet scrolled further. Oh, here's one from 1945. Emergency classification review. The humans have developed atomic weapons and immediately used them. This is consistent with aggressive species behavior. However, they then spent the next several decades not using them again, despite having thousands. They appear to have frightened themselves. Current theory: humans capable of learning from mistakes, but only really expensive mistakes. Class 17 status. Confirmed. Another researcher, a physicist named Devon Cross, found a particularly dense section. Holy shit, there's a whole subsection analyzing human entertainment. They watched our movies and television and completely lost their minds. Quote, human entertainment frequently depicts scenarios that would cause immediate societal collapse in any rational species. They create fictional scenarios about apocalyptic disasters they cause, artificial intelligences they create that turn against them, aliens they provoke into warfare, and time travel paradoxes they initiate through stupidity. They then enjoy watching these scenarios as entertainment. They actively pay currency to experience simulated terror of their own making. Psychological profile: incomprehensible. The room erupted in laughter. They're not wrong, though, Harriet admitted. We do love our disaster movies. Oh, it gets better, Devon continued reading. Analysis of human cultural concept, YOLO. Translation approximate: you only live once. Observed behavior: humans use this phrase to justify decisions that actively endanger their singular life. Logic absent. Threat assessment high, but mostly to themselves. Related concepts: hold my beer, what's the worst that could happen, and watch this. All indicate premeditated, dangerous behavior undertaken for entertainment or social status. Conclusion: humans are speed-running Darwinism. Even Kenji, who'd been taking the file seriously, had to laugh at that one. They're not entirely wrong. We do have a concerning relationship with risk assessment. The files went on for thousands of pages. Some entries were analytical, some were clearly panicked, and some read like someone having a slow-motion nervous breakdown while trying to maintain scientific objectivity. One entry from Earth year 1969 simply read, "They went to their moon using controlled explosions, while 3 of them sat on top of the explosions, and they did it to win an argument with another group of humans, not for resources, not for survival, for pride." Class 17. Status: extremely confirmed. But buried deep in the files, past the analysis and the panic and the confused observations, was something more interesting. A theoretical paper written by a Graythian scientist named Quellindor, dated approximately 50 Earth years ago. Kenji found it late one night, cross-referencing documents. The paper was titled, "On the Potential Benefits of Unpredictability in Galactic Civilization, a Controversial Hypothesis." He read it 3 times, then called Amara at 2 in the morning. "You need to read this," he said, "right now." Amara, groggy but alert, pulled up the file. She read in silence for 10 minutes. Then very quietly she said, "Is this suggesting what I think it's suggesting? That the galaxy needs humans?" Kenji's voice was excited. "Yes, that's exactly what it's suggesting." Quellindor's paper argued that galactic civilization had become stagnant, too predictable, too ordered. Every species following the same patterns, making the same choices, arriving at the same conclusions. Innovation had slowed to a crawl. Art had become formulaic. Even warfare had become boring, following established protocols and expected outcomes. And then there was the section that made Kenji's heart race. If introduced carefully, a Class 17 species could serve as a catalyst for renewed creativity and innovation across galactic civilization. Their unpredictability would force other species to reconsider established patterns. Their chaos would break stagnant systems. Their humanity would remind us what we've lost in our pursuit of order and rationality. The paper had been rejected by every major scientific journal. Quellindor had been laughed out of academic circles. The council had buried it in classified files and pretended it didn't exist. But someone had kept it. Someone thought it was important enough to include in the Class 17 documentation. "We need to find Quellindor," Amara decided. "If they're still alive, this changes everything." Quellindor was still alive, living in academic exile on a remote station in the Outer Rim, still writing papers that nobody read. When they received the message that Earth wanted to speak with them, they nearly dropped their tea, which was a significant gesture for a species that had perfect motor control. The conversation happened via quantum communication, with Quellindor appearing as a hologram in the UN conference room. They looked like a philosophy textbook that had learned to make facial expressions, all of which conveyed varying degrees of surprise. "You read my paper." Quellindor's voice was 3 octaves too high. "I thought those files were sealed forever. We demanded full transparency," Amara explained. "And your paper is the only one that doesn't treat humanity like a disaster waiting to happen. You think we could actually be good for the galaxy?" "I don't just think it, I'm certain of it." Quellindor was becoming animated now, their appendages gesturing wildly. "The galaxy has been using the same solutions to the same problems for millennia. We're stuck in a loop. We need disruption. We need chaos. We need something that doesn't fit the patterns, and humans are perfect for that." "Okay, but that's a lot of pressure," Ephraim pointed out. "You're essentially asking us to be the galaxy's chaos agents." "You're already chaos agents. That's the point. You don't have to try. You just have to be yourselves. You'll naturally introduce concepts and approaches that other species would never consider. You'll ask questions nobody thought to ask. You'll propose solutions that seem absurd but might actually work." Threxis, who'd been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "Quellindor, your paper was rejected because it was considered dangerously radical. The Council believes stability is more important than innovation." "The Council is wrong," Quellindor shot back. "We're dying of stability. Our civilization is becoming calcified. We need humans to shake things up before we stagnate completely." So we're supposed to be the galaxy's weirdo friends who make everyone uncomfortable at parties, but also make things interesting. Kenji was trying to pass this metaphor. Exactly. You're the friend who suggests going to the weird restaurant instead of the chain everyone knows. You're the colleague who proposes the unusual solution everyone else was too afraid to suggest. You're the species that makes everyone else go, "I never thought of it that way," and then realizes they've been thinking about everything wrong for centuries. There was a long pause while everyone processed this. That's either the most flattering or most insulting thing anyone's ever said about humanity, Patricia Holloway, who'd been invited to document the exchange, muttered. It's both, Quellendor confirmed cheerfully. You're wonderful and terrible and exactly what the galaxy needs. Amara looked at her fellow humans, then at Threxis, then back at Quellendor. All right, let's say we accept this role. What does that actually look like in practice? That's the beautiful part. Quellendor was practically vibrating with excitement. We don't know. That's the entire point. You'll do unexpected things. You'll create unforeseen solutions. You'll probably cause several minor diplomatic incidents and at least one major crisis. But you'll also push us forward in ways we can't predict. You're asking us to be professionally unpredictable, Kenji said slowly. That's possibly the most human job description I have ever heard. The conversation with Quellendor lasted for hours, and by the end, something had shifted. Earth wasn't just going to be passively integrated into galactic civilization. Humanity was going to actively participate in reshaping it. But first, they had to deal with a more immediate problem. The leaked files had caused chaos across the galaxy, and not everyone was happy about Earth's new status. 3 days after Quellendor's conversation, a group calling themselves the Preservation Coalition sent a message to the Galactic Council. They represented approximately 40 species who believed that introducing Class 17 chaos into galactic civilization was suicidal. They demanded Earth remain quarantined indefinitely. Their representative, a being named Vortex, who looked like anger given physical form and a really expensive suit, addressed the council in a session that was broadcast across 600 systems. The humans are a threat. Vortex's voice somehow managed to sound both smooth and threatening. Not because of their technology, but because of their nature. They will destabilize everything we've built. They will introduce dangerous ideologies. They will corrupt our rational civilization with their chaos. Amara, attending as Earth's first official observer, stood up. May I respond to that? The council chairperson, an ancient being named Selthrix, who'd been around long enough to remember when FTL travel was invented, nodded. The human observer may speak. Thank you. Vortex, you say we're a threat because of our nature. I say our nature is exactly what makes us valuable. Yes, we're chaotic. Yes, we're unpredictable. But we're also adaptable, creative and resilient. We've survived ice ages, plagues, world wars and reality television. We've turned disasters into opportunities and made art out of suffering. And maybe, just maybe, that's not a flaw. Maybe that's exactly what a civilization needs to survive in a universe that doesn't care about your neat little plans. You prove my point, Vortex countered. You celebrate chaos. You embrace disorder. No, we embrace adaptability, Amara shot back. There's a difference. You've built a civilization on predictability, and that's made you fragile. One unexpected change, and your entire system threatens to collapse. We've built our civilization on expecting the unexpected. We're prepared for chaos because chaos is all we've ever known. The chamber erupted in arguments. Some species agreed with Vortex. Others were intrigued by Amara's words. A few were trying to figure out what reality television was and whether it was actually a survival challenge. Threxis, watching from the sidelines, realized something profound. This wasn't just about Earth anymore. This was about what the galaxy wanted to be, stable and stagnant or chaotic and alive. The vote came 3 hours later. By a narrow margin, the Council voted to proceed with Earth's experimental integration. The Preservation Coalition was furious. Vortex stormed out, vowing this wasn't over. Several species threatened to leave the Council entirely, but the decision stood. Earth was officially part of galactic civilization. Sort of. In a weird, experimental, we're not sure this is a good idea, but let's try it anyway, kind of way, which was, when you thought about it, the most human possible outcome. 6 months after first contact, Earth had changed in ways nobody predicted. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but definitely weirdly. There was now a galactic embassy in Geneva, staffed by representatives from 40 different species, all trying to figure out how to deal with humans. There was a human embassy on the Council station, staffed by humans trying to figure out how to deal with aliens. Both groups were equally confused, which somehow made things work. Trade had begun. Humans exported art, entertainment, and something the aliens called creative chaos consulting, which was essentially paying humans to look at problems from bizarre angles. Aliens exported technology, scientific knowledge, and a device that made really good coffee, which humanity valued more than the FTL drive schematics. There had been incidents. A human comedian accidentally caused a diplomatic crisis by making a joke that translated into a declaration of war in Krelthian. A Florian diplomat burst into tears during a human funeral and had to be explained the concept of catharsis again. The methane breather developed a concerning obsession with human sitcoms, and nobody knew how to address it. But there had also been breakthroughs. A joint human-Grathian research team discovered a new approach to quantum computing by combining rigid mathematical precision with what humans called just trying random stuff and seeing what happens. A Bristovian artist collaborated with human musicians to create something that was either the most beautiful sound ever produced or a war crime against eardrums, depending on who you asked. Earth agriculture techniques were revolutionizing food production on 36 worlds, because humans had apparently been farming wrong by galactic standards, but getting better results anyway. Quellindor's paper was republished. This time, it was taken seriously. Academic circles across the galaxy began discussing the human question, not as a threat, but as an opportunity, and slowly, carefully, other species began to wonder if maybe they'd been doing things wrong, if maybe their perfect systems and predictable patterns had been holding them back, if maybe a little chaos wasn't so bad. On Earth, in a small apartment in Tokyo, Kenji Sato was writing the conclusion to his revised thesis. It was no longer theoretical. It was documented fact. First contact with humanity, he typed, did not result in war, alliance, or conquest. Instead, it resulted in the entire galaxy having an existential crisis about the nature of civilization, progress, and whether being predictable is actually a good thing. Humans have been part of galactic society for 6 months, and we've already made everyone reconsider everything they thought they knew. Some call this dangerous, some call it revolutionary, we call it Tuesday. He paused, then added one final line. Turns out, the best way to change the universe is to just be yourself, even if yourself is absolutely baffling to everyone else. At the Galactic Council chambers, Threxes was having his quarterly breakdown in his office, which had become routine enough that his colleagues had stopped checking on him. He stared at the latest report from Earth, which documented 37 new diplomatic incidents, 12 cultural misunderstandings, and one case where a human had accidentally invented a new form of mathematics while trying to calculate a restaurant tip. "They're insane," he muttered to himself. "They're chaotic. They're unpredictable. They're going to make everything so complicated." Then he pulled up footage from a joint human-alien art exhibition that had opened on the Council station last week. He watched aliens and humans standing together, admiring each other's work, asking questions, sharing perspectives. He watched a Krelthian warrior carefully explaining the symbolism in their battle murals to a human child who was asking, "But why is everything so angry?" He watched a human painter showing a Florian how to use a brush, both of them laughing when the paint went everywhere. Threxis sighed. "They're going to make everything so complicated," he repeated. Then, very quietly, he smiled. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. On the edges of the galaxy, Vortex and the Preservation Coalition were watching, planning, waiting. They hadn't given up on their goal of keeping humanity contained. They believed chaos was a threat, and they were prepared to do whatever necessary to protect the order they'd built. But they had underestimated something crucial about humans. Something the Council was just beginning to understand. Something that made Class 17 not just unpredictable, but potentially unstoppable. Humans didn't just adapt to chaos, they thrived in it. They'd spent their entire existence as a species, turning disasters into opportunities, making jokes while standing at the edge of extinction, and somehow, impossibly, surviving everything the universe threw at them. And now they weren't alone anymore. Now they had allies who were learning that maybe survival wasn't about perfect plans and predictable outcomes. Maybe it was about being flexible enough to handle whatever came next. The galaxy was changing, slowly, chaotically, unpredictably, and for the first time in millennia, nobody knew exactly what would happen next, which meant, in a weird way, that Quelindor had been right. The galaxy was dying of stability, and humanity was the cure. A loud, chaotic, frequently confusing cure that asked too many questions and made jokes at inappropriate times, and somehow made everyone around them start questioning whether they'd been doing everything wrong. 2 years after the files leaked, after the panic subsided and the reality set in, the Galactic Council commissioned a formal study on humanity's integration into galactic civilization. The findings were classified, but one section was leaked to the press. Of course it was leaked. Nothing stayed classified anymore. That was another thing humanity had introduced to the galaxy, the concept that secrets were really just information that hadn't been shared yet. The leaked section read, "Classification Review, Earth remains designated Class 17, not as a threat category, but as a recognition of fundamental difference. Humans represent a civilization built on chaos, adaptation, and what they call hope, which roughly translates to optimism despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. This should be impossible. It should not work. By every logical model, humanity should have destroyed itself centuries ago. Instead, they've thrived. Recommendation: stop trying to predict humans. Start trying to learn from them. Additional note: they're teaching the galaxy to laugh at itself again. Psychological impact: unexpectedly positive. Nobody saw that coming, which is apparently the entire point." At the bottom of the report, someone had added a handwritten note in the margin. Just 3 words, in slightly shaky galactic standard script. "We were wrong." Harriet Vollmer framed that leaked section and hung it in her office at Farpoint Station, right next to the original signal detection that had started everything. She'd become something of a celebrity, the human who first heard the galaxy talking. Students and researchers came from across Earth to visit her station, to see where it all began. One day, a young grad student asked her what she thought it all meant. The leaks, the classifications, the chaos of first contact. Harriet thought about it for a long moment, looking at the stars through her window, knowing that out there, hundreds of civilizations were watching Earth, learning from Earth, being changed by Earth. "I think," she said finally, "it means we're not the mistake the galaxy thought we were. We're the randomness it forgot it needed. The variables in an equation that got too stable. The chaos that reminds everyone that the universe doesn't follow rules, it just exists. And you either learn to dance with the uncertainty or you calcify and die. We're the species that learned to dance, and now we're teaching the galaxy the steps." The students scribbled notes frantically. "That's beautiful, Dr. Vollmer. Poetic, even." "Yeah, well," Harriet grinned. "Turns out humans are pretty good at poetry, even when we're talking about astrophysics and galactic diplomacy. The aliens find it baffling, which makes it even better. Somewhere in the depths of space, on a monitoring station that officially didn't exist, a Krelthian analyst named Threnix was compiling data for a report that nobody would read because it contradicted everything the Preservation Coalition believed. The report showed that in the 2 years since humanity's integration, galactic innovation had increased by 47%. New patents were being filed at rates not seen in millennia. Art movements were exploding across hundreds of worlds. Scientific breakthroughs were accelerating. Even military tactics were being revised because humans kept suggesting strategies that seemed suicidal but somehow worked. Threnix stared at the numbers, then at the cultural impact assessments, then at the economic projections. Every single metric pointed in the same direction. Humanity was good for the galaxy, not despite their chaos, but because of it. Threnix encrypted the report, sent it to their contact in the Council, and then did something they'd never done before in their 40 years of intelligence analysis. They smiled. On Earth, life continued. Humanity had learned they weren't alone, learned they were classified as fundamentally unpredictable chaos incarnate, learned that the galaxy had been watching them for centuries, and collectively responded with a massive planetary shrug, and yeah, that tracks. Because that was the thing about humans. They could absorb absolutely insane information and just incorporate it into their worldview like it was no big deal. Aliens exist? Cool. We're terrifying to them? Weird, but okay. The galaxy needs us to be ourselves because we're chaos incarnate? Sure, we can do that. We've been doing that anyway. Politicians argued about the best way to manage galactic relations. Scientists collaborated on impossible projects. Artists created works that made aliens question their entire understanding of beauty. Regular people went to work, paid their bills, complained about traffic, and occasionally looked up at the stars, knowing that someone up there was looking back and probably taking notes about how humans managed to function at all. And every so often, someone would remember that 2 years ago, humanity had been alone in the universe. That they'd believed they were the only intelligent life in an incomprehensibly vast cosmos. That they'd been wrong in the most spectacular way possible. Amara Okonkwo was giving a speech at the 2-year anniversary of First Contact. Representatives from 40 species attended, along with roughly 2 billion humans watching via broadcast. She stood at the podium in the UN General Assembly Hall, looking at the crowd of humans and aliens, and felt the weight of history pressing down. 2 years ago, she began, we learned we weren't alone. We learned we were classified as something that shouldn't exist. We learned that our chaos and unpredictability made us terrifying to civilizations that had been sailing the stars for millennia. And we learned that maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what the universe needed. Not another predictable species following the same patterns, but something new, something unexpected, something fundamentally, undeniably, chaotically human. We didn't ask to be Class 17. We didn't ask to be the species that breaks every model and defies every prediction. But here we are. And you know what? We're going to be the best damn Class 17 species this galaxy has ever seen. Which admittedly isn't saying much since we're the only Class 17 species. But the point stands. The crowd laughed. Humans and aliens alike. Because that was another thing humanity had taught the galaxy. How to laugh at themselves. The files leaked in red 2 years ago, Amara continued, her voice growing stronger. A warning, a danger signal, a classification that shouldn't exist. But red doesn't just mean danger. It means attention. It means importance. It means, look at this. And the galaxy looked. And what they saw wasn't a threat. What they saw was possibility. What they saw was a mirror showing them what they'd lost in their pursuit of perfect order. What they saw was US. Chaotic, unpredictable, occasionally brilliant, frequently stupid, always surprising. And that changed everything. She paused, looking directly at the cameras, knowing her words would reach across hundreds of light years to stations and ships and worlds where humans now worked, lived, and stumbled their way through galactic society. So here's to Class 17. Here's to being the random variable in an equation that got too neat. Here's to asking questions nobody thought to ask, and suggesting solutions nobody saw coming. Here's to teaching the galaxy that chaos isn't the enemy of civilization. It's the fuel. And here's to humanity, the species crazy enough to look at an incomprehensibly vast and terrifying universe and say, yeah, okay, but watch this. The applause was deafening. Human cheers mixed with alien vocalizations that ranged from whistles to roars, to what sounded like controlled explosions because Kavaline was there and Bristovians expressed approval through volume. Threxis, watching from his seat, shook his head in amazement. 2 years ago, he'd been choking on purple oatmeal while discovering his career was about to become infinitely more complicated. Now he was sitting in an assembly hall on Earth, listening to a human explain why chaos was actually good, and somehow agreeing with her. I need a vacation, he muttered. You need therapy, Kvalin boomed from 3 seats over, somehow hearing him despite the noise. That too, Threxis admitted, and somewhere in the archived files of the Galactic Council, the original Class 17 designation sat waiting. Updated now, revised, but still marked in red. Because some things were too important to file away in normal colors. Some things demanded attention, demanded recognition. The file had a new addendum, added just that morning by Councillor Selthrix, who'd lived long enough to see empires rise and fall, and had thought nothing could surprise them anymore. The addendum read, Class 17, humanity, unpredictable, chaotic, impossible, necessary, status, active, threat level to stagnation. Prognosis, the galaxy will never be boring again. And in the margins, in Selthrix's own handwriting, barely visible unless you were looking for it, thank the void for that.